I mean, the amount of the price per gallon of gasoline could vary wildly, which is not taken into account in the projection. You can't. There's no way for you to assume what that number is going to look like.
No, that's correct.
There are disruptions every day that we can think about, and many of us are all too well aware of them. So I don't think that that attempt succeeds anywhere close to where it needs to. And again, it perpetuates what itself is a flawed, deeply flawed structure. Dependence on people buying lots of gallons when in fact we're trying to reduce the amount of consumption.
Well, I think that's a good segue. Thank you very much. And we really appreciate you coming in and helping explain this proposal. Obviously, there's a lot of folks here, myself included, who have some real problems with it. We didn't even get into questions of some of this being federally leveraged, but we did start to address some of the questions of the real costs associated with this proposal. But in the interest of time, I'd like to thank you for doing this and to call up folks from the LAO's office to help us out. So thank you. And if you could state your name, identify yourself, and then we'll go right into this. And this will give us a chance to talk about other proposals as well as the governor's proposal.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Jessica DiGiambattista with the Analyst's Office, here with my colleague Eric Thronson. We have a handout for you today that summarizes the governor's fuel tax swap proposal. I'm not sure if you all have it. And then also talks about some of the impacts of the proposal. Since the Department of Finance has already gone over the main points of it, I'll go quickly through the beginning part of the handout here in the interest of time. Page 1 of the handout, we have a couple of charts here to show the revenues that are charged under current law and how those funds are used compared to what would happen under the governor's proposal. And as you can see in the chart on the top of the page, under current law from the 6% state sales tax, transit would receive about $1.6 billion in revenues. Local roads would get about $629 million, and the State Transportation Improvement Program, or STIP, would get another $629 million. Under the governor's proposal, the sales tax would be eliminated and replaced with an increase in the fuel excise tax, which would generate about $1.8 billion. And this is about $1 billion less than what we'd be getting under current law. And so those funds would be used to, as Mr. Monroe has stated, to offset the loss to the STIP and to local roads by giving them each $629 million, and then providing $603 million for debt service. And that additional, that $1.8 billion would just be lost revenue, and that would be what makes up the tax cut. It equates to about a 6 cent per gallon tax cut. On page 3 of the handout, we have a chart that shows that as the state's transportation debt service costs rise over the next 5 to 10 years, the tax rate that the governor's proposing would increase to provide the maximum amount of debt service reimbursement possible. And as they have indicated, it would also rise to match the amount of funding for the STIP and local roads that's projected currently under the sales tax. The chart at the top of the page shows projected debt service costs over the next 5 years, and as is shown in the chart, a portion of the debt service costs would be paid from the new excise tax, and there's a portion that would not be eligible to be paid from this tax. And so in addition to the tax swap, the governor is also proposing some one-time solutions in the current year and budget year to use existing transit funds to pay debt service on transit bonds. In total, in 10-11, the governor's proposal would pay all transportation debt service amounting to about $929 million. The tax swap piece of the proposal would provide ongoing general fund benefit by paying between 50 to 65% of the state's transportation debt service on an ongoing basis. As you can see in the chart, the light gray area at the top of the chart represents the amount of general fund benefit that would be achieved over time by this proposal. In total, over the next 10 years, the proposal would generate about $11.5 billion in general fund relief. In addition, as you've noted, Mr. Chair, the proposal would achieve some savings in education by reducing the state's minimum guarantee to fund education. We want to point out also on this chart that the top solid line on the chart represents tax revenues under current law with the sales tax. As you can see, it isn't until the last year, 2021, that revenues under the governor's proposal get back to the level that they're at today. So it's a significant reduction overall.
I'll be discussing some of the impacts of the proposal, as well as some possible alternatives that could potentially improve outcomes. Starting on page 5, by no longer collecting revenues from the sales tax on fuels, this proposal permanently eliminates all traditional state transit funding, as you've pointed out earlier. This includes STA, the State Transit Assistance, which is the transit operating subsidy, which was suspended last year, meaning under current law, no STA would be received in 1011 regardless of the outcome of this proposal. Also, any additional transit capital projects that won't be funded by the remaining Prop 1B funding, and as well other transit-related expenditures traditionally paid for with these revenues, such as the operating contract for any intercity rail service, would also be eliminated. According to trailer bill language, these other transit-related expenditures will become general fund obligations once current resources are exhausted, which will create some out-year liabilities, which are described on the figure in page 5. In addition, the governor's proposal raises the fuel excise tax, which is traditionally dedicated to maintaining the state's current system, and then uses none of those new revenues to repair the state's aging highways and bridges. We have indicated in the past that the state's program for highway repairs and maintenance is chronically underfunded, and we've recommended an increase in the fuel excise tax to help fund this critical need. For example, Caltrans estimates that $400 to $500 million in additional annual funding for preventive maintenance work could save the state several billions of dollars annually by avoiding the cost of major repairs in the future. Basically, by not funding repairs and maintenance today, we are increasing the state's future highway obligations as the system continues to degrade and require more costly repair work. Due to the state's current fiscal challenges, we believe the governor's proposal has some merit because of the substantial ongoing general fund benefits. However, we believe there are options available to the legislature that could improve upon the proposal. First, we believe the legislature could maintain transportation revenues at or near current levels and provide additional funding for highway repairs, which ultimately saves the state and motorists money. Alternatively, or in conjunction, the legislature could adopt only part of the governor's proposal and maintain the diesel sales tax revenues, creating more flexibility in future spending options. We're happy to go into further details on these options, should you like us to, and they're also outlined in the last pages of the handout today. Finally, we believe you have some current year opportunities for general fund solutions, which are described on page 8. The governor's budget includes $57 million in transit debt service that Mr. Monroe had alluded to earlier to be paid in the current year from existing resources. We believe there is, in fact, $140 million in transit-eligible debt service that could be counted toward a current year solution. In addition, the legislature could use miscellaneous highway revenues, known as non-Article 19 restricted revenues, to pay for debt service in the current year, similar to the governor's proposal for the budget year, for an additional $79 million in general fund solution. In total, with legislative action during the special session, we believe you could realize $219 million in current year solutions, which is $160 million more than is contained in the governor's proposal. That concludes our presentation, and we're happy to answer questions.
Okay. First question, then I'll go to Mr. Fear in 1 second. Talking about general fund savings, couldn't we actually get a lot more general fund savings if we had some form of this excise tax and we used, if we're lowering sales tax to some extent, they're putting in a fee in on the other side, we used some of that headway, so to speak, to close a tax loophole like the like-kind exchanges or mandatory single sales. Wouldn't that be an opportunity to get a tremendous amount of debt relief?
I'm sorry, just to clarify the question, in terms of if you're reducing some taxes, could you then increase other taxes?
Well, or close particular loopholes using a majority vote.
I believe that some of those options are available. I know that there's a number of staff options that have been floating around, and there's certainly some possibility to do that. You'd need to make sure to check with Legislative Council. Ultimately, they would decide whether or not a bill would be majority vote or not. So.
But certainly, when you're talking about priorities and trying to weigh and balance whether you're cutting transit and you're also trying to fund additional debt relief, there are other alternatives that aren't on the table here in the LAO's proposal, and that certainly aren't in the governor's proposal, that would actually allow us to maintain our current levels of transportation funding, or at least get close to it, and also have substantial debt relief without raising taxes by just closing loopholes that would be enabled under this kind of scenario.
I think you have a lot of flexibility in ways that you can modify the proposal that the governor's put forward. That's one of the benefits of the proposal, but I can't, it sounds like maybe you have a specific thing in mind, and without knowing what that is, we can't really comment on that. Okay. I'm sorry.
Mr. Pierre.
Just a couple questions. First, all of us are really struggling to try to find current year savings, and I really appreciate the effort to try to find some additional money there. You identified $219 million that you think could be saved in the current year. What is not clear to me is what kinds of expenditures would be foregone when one realizes these savings. In particular, is it maintenance that would go unperformed? What exactly wouldn't happen?
This current year savings is actually already adopted in the current year budget. The budget that was adopted last July included $225 million in debt service from the PTA. We just haven't been paying it.
Oh, I see. Okay, fair enough.
And so it isn't a taking away from anything else.
Yeah, so this is an important ingredient in this huge gap we have to fund. And Mr. Chair, if I might just real quickly turn to Mr. Monroe for 1 second, because you asked a question which I am in complete sync with, and that has to do with what our priorities are and how they're expressed in this proposal with regard to the diminution in the Prop 98 guarantee. And I think the answer that I heard was that it was not directly responsive. It was, well, we could always spend more on education if we want to. But there's clearly something, it appears to me, that one of the intended goals of this proposal from the administration standpoint is to reduce the Prop 98 guarantee. Is that in fact one of the intended goals of this, or is that just a byproduct of this proposal?
Speaking from the transportation side, it's my understanding it's more of a byproduct. That said, we are not proposing to fund it higher than that, but my understanding is more of a byproduct of our proposal.
Okay. Yeah, because I think that the chair expressed very well some priority that we associate with education in his opening remarks, and I just wanted to really understand if it's an unintended or byproduct of this. That's one thing. We can try to find common ground about eliminating that unfortunate consequence of what is otherwise a transportation-related approach. If, by contrast, it's an intended result, then we have a wider gulf to fill. I'm trying to understand where we stand. And the answer is I'm not quite sure where we stand in that regard. Can you clarify anything further about that?
Well, just say that obviously
Do we differ in our priorities when it comes to education as expressed in this proposal, or do we have the same priority and we just need to find a way to alleviate a problem this proposal creates?
Well, I think from our perspective, we don't believe we can afford to fund it. Clearly, we've produced a budget and a proposal that doesn't fund it above the new lower minimum that would result from what we're proposing here. So I think in answer to your question, all I can say is that we don't, in terms of the budget we've produced, we've assumed or we believe we cannot afford to fund it at a higher level without cutting something else.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Sorry.
I think what you're saying is there's only so much money and you're trying to make some decisions here and keep everything afloat. Would that be safe?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. So it's up to the legislature to set the priorities with what little remaining and declining revenues that we have. Thank you.
Thanks. It's a good point that this is a statement of priorities, and that's what we're looking at. And that's obviously what's expressed by this proposal. Question about the the governor's, and it's really for the LAO, that the governor's proposal impact on federal funds and maintenance of efforts under the stimulus, how would they be impacted by his proposal?
Yeah, we're not aware of any impacts on the local road and the state highway side because the programs would be funded at the same level that they would be funded under current law. There wouldn't be any impacts from that. Not sure if the transit operators have a maintenance of effort.
Right. Well, that would be their issue.
Yeah, the transit funds don't flow through the state, and so I'm not sure.
Right. Correct. And we've worked with the department to make sure that this would not violate an MOE or put into risk any of the ARA funding.
Okay, thank you. Another question for the LAO about we talk a lot about the impact of transit funds with spillover and how it's varied over the years. Could you talk a little bit about the annual trend, what we've really given to transit, what they really need, and what would be, if you had to pick a number that would be appropriate, what that would be?
Mr. Chair, I came prepared to talk about past, the history, a little bit of historical state transit assistance funding. I don't know if we're able to say what would be an appropriate amount or how much they need.
Historically, what has it been? Obviously, last year we had the gutting of it, but in past years there's been a fair consistency.
Sure.
And just to sort of, as everyone contemplates all these different proposals, it's good to know what the baseline is or what the baseline has been, as opposed to operating in the vacuum of what really should be or what has been proposed and everything else.
Well, I'm providing right now a chart that lists the history of the state STA funding since its inception in 1979. And as you can see, for the most part, it averaged between $40 and $100 million a year. It varied because of the way it was originally tied to the spillover. And when there were years when there wasn't spillover, then it disappeared. As time passed, there were more revenues that were linked to the STA funding program, and so the funding did grow over time. But traditionally, I mean, you could say that it's grown from roughly $40 million to $100 million a year up until recently, when a number of statutory changes and other issues created quite a bit of funding for them. So.
Any further questions from the panel? Mr. Monty.
This is for anybody on the panel, but remind me how the excise tax increase, if this flip takes place, how is that calculated over the 10 years out?
I'm sorry if I'll try to understand the question here, but what we've done is say, first of all, what revenue do we need to get as much as we would have gotten for local roads and highways under Prop 42, an estimate, and then we've gone forecast that, and then we've looked at the debt service that we need, or the amount that we need for highway-related debt service, and then we get that amount, and then we look at our forecast of estimated gallons, and we use that to calculate the...
So the increase in the excise tax, the percentage stays the same, and you project more revenue based on more gallons of gas sold? Or is it going to raise over the next 10 years?
It's going to raise over the next 10
and
years.
How do you determine the index by which it gets raised?
We target the amount that we need to get the Prop 42 amount and the debt service.
Okay, so you have a target objective, and you adjust the excise tax rate over the next 10 years to meeting that target?
Correct.
If I could, Mr. Monning, another way to look at it would be that a portion of the increased excise tax would grow equivalent to what the Department of Finance currently estimates sales tax would grow for the STIP and local roads pieces, the sales tax on gasoline, and that goes to those programs. And then the other portion of it would grow at the rate of growth that transportation debt service is expected to grow over the 10 years. So those would be the two components.
And is that adjusted on an annual basis then, as
Yes.
you're making that calculation?
Well, we're making the calculation for the next 10 years in our proposal. We haven't provided for, to look each year and say, okay, well, where are we and what do we need to
Right,
do?
you won't know that until...
The trailer bill schedules out the change in rate over the next 10 years and does not provide a mechanism to come back and relook at it and see if that was the correct rate or if it should be higher or lower.
Correct.
Thanks.
I would point out, even if you could predict something that is so difficult to predict and accurately track what the sales tax would be, it's a real missed opportunity because we all know that that cars are becoming more efficient and everything else. What we need to do is have vehicle miles traveled or some other new way to actually capture a more appropriate usage of the roads and highways and reflect that in the gas. And it's a real missed opportunity because you could have at least approximated that a little better by adjusting for the CPI or adjusting for finding some other growth factor. So anyway, I think that's a lost opportunity there. But we should move on. Unless I don't want to cut you off. There was a last comment. Feel free to make it.
I just wanted to say that I think when we do estimate the gallonage, that takes into some of account what you're talking about. I can't really. I'd have to go back and get more details for you, but we do take into account some of what you're talking about.
Any last comments from the LAO?
We just think that you do have options to modify the proposal, including possibly indexing the gas tax to an index such as the CPI, or there's other indices available, and that's something that our office has recommended in the past in order to maintain growth of the revenues, compared to the costs of the programs they fund.
Great, thank you. One last
Just
thing,
on
then
that
we'll move
point,
on to stakeholders.
sorry. You comment on some flexibility on how we might address that. Is there any flexibility on, as opposed to a total flip of eliminating all the sales tax to reducing the percentage of the sales tax? Because when you look at this spike based on the cost of gasoline, as fuel prices go up, we're going to lose that benefit to local transit districts as a function of increased fuel prices. But the question is, and maybe for anybody on the panel, but do we have the flexibility to address the fundamental premise of this, which is eliminating all the sales tax?
Well, first, I'd like to make sure to be clear that spike in 06-07 had a lot to do with a repayment by the general fund of past transportation loans, and not necessarily all linked to the price of gas. Second, absolutely, one of our alternatives that we had suggested was to not eliminate all sales tax on all fuels, to not eliminate the sales tax on diesel. That creates an opportunity for about $300 to $400 million over time to go into the PTA, which in turn could fund both the ongoing transit-related expenditures that I'd mentioned, like intercity rail, that will become general fund obligations, as well as the opportunity to either fund transit operations or other general fund transit debt service that is eligible to be paid out of the PTA. So we think that there's a multitude of options to modify this proposal, including that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and thank you all for your testimony. And the next we'll be hearing from stakeholders, and to try to keep it a little bit organized, we're going to start with local government, then labor leaders, then environmental leaders, and then business leaders. And so we're going to start by calling up folks, local government folks. I know we have representatives from League of Counties, League of Cities, California Transit Association, and Self-Help Counties. So folks who are here on behalf of a local government entity, please come forward and go ahead and we'll start from left to right, and we'll introduce yourself, and we'll...
Your left
No, that's true. Thank you.
Joshua Shaw, Executive Director of the California Transit Association, representing all of your local public transit systems that would be essentially put out of business by this proposal, notwithstanding the false 2% figure that you heard. Urge you right out of the gate, reject this proposal, look at some of the options. Now let's go through some of the reasons why. Department of Finance, actually a couple of the members, some of them were Monning and some of them were Fuhrer, talked about jobs. If you look at the paper that I just distributed to you, the first set talks about jobs. Public transit agencies in this state, love it or hate it, employ more than 40,000 people. we're not just talking about the potential impacts of future cuts under the governor's proposal. Transit, as has been mentioned, transit funding has been diverted in 3 of the last 4 budget cycles significantly to the tune of $3.4 billion. The first page that I handed you shows the impact. Agencies have already laid off or fired thousands of workers in the state. Some of them were fewer, and Senator Monning mentioned impacts on local transit systems. Mr. Monning talked about in Santa Cruz. The next set of data shows you all across the state the fare hikes that agencies have already implemented. Yeah, transportation should be more of a user fee. Agencies recognize that. To recover more of their operating budget, they have charged their customers. Then I would say to you, are these customers the folks that can afford to pay for 100% of a transit operating cost? I can't afford to pay for the salary of a policeman if my house gets robbed tonight, God forbid. That's why I'm glad the state subsidizes public transit, if I have to call that policeman, through a combination of state and local funds. This proposal completely abandons that idea. Agencies have also instituted service cuts across the state, hundreds of thousands of hours. And I just heard from the OCTA CEO that he's got to implement a 150,000 hour service cut on top of a 20% cut on his transit system over the next several months if he doesn't get something restored out of the state budget. So the service cuts are there. Agencies have also been delaying infrastructure projects. They have not been building some of the light rail lines. They have not been buying some of the buses that they need to keep their fleets up to date. Now this question of, the only reason I heard from the Department of Finance on why we're doing this is because transit agencies have not relied on the state for very much of their total funding. Please look at the third piece of paper I gave you. It's a long, boring-looking list of transit agencies across the state. But according to the State Controller's Office, dozens and dozens and dozens of transit agencies rely on the State Transit Assistance Program for between 50 to 90% of their local operating budget. Now, it is true that those dozens and dozens and dozens are mostly the smaller to rural to suburban to small city transit agencies. When you throw in some of the very largest urban transit systems, who in some cases have local sales taxes, you start to see that there is a more diverse set of revenues that come into their operating budgets. But even those agencies still rely on the state for much more than has been represented to you. Orange County, this data is as of 06-07. We don't have the 07-08, 08, 09 data. But OCTA in that year, just to randomly pick some agencies, OCTA relied on the STA for 15% of its operating budget. Foothill Transit, at random, I'll just mention 11%. LA Metro, for a couple other folks who might care, 12%. And Mr. Monning told you that Santa Cruz and his district relied on this program for more than 20% of its budget. So this 2% number may be some kind of average, but the median, according to our calculations, is for more than 11%. Agencies are relying on you for more than 11%. Well, let's admit that number doesn't even sound that big. What's the impact? I just told you that thousands of people have been laid off. Service cuts are already happening. We're already charging more folks who do ride the bus. In too many cities and counties, there is no weekend service. There's no night service on the weekdays. What about the folks who work swing shift, who work at night? How are folks getting to school? The impact of the reduction in the state funding has already translated. The governor's proposal would make that permanent, but we are already suffering and urge you to restore some of these funding, some of the funding streams. Assemblymember Fewer raises the question of, how should we do transportation policy? And I'd urge you to think about what he said. Don't do it in a budget act. Maybe it is time to rethink how funding happens, because that's the other thing I heard finance say about why we're doing this. It's time to rethink how transportation funding happens. Great. Don't do it after this one hearing. Don't do it on a budget committee hearing and a vote on your floor. Do it in a policy committee. Think about the mix of sales tax, excise tax, the relative proportion of subsidies for different modes, et cetera. Don't do it in one fell swoop. I also want to point out something about a couple things that LAO mentioned to you. On the very first page of the LAO's document, they showed you all the sales tax money at stake for a variety of transportation modes. I want to point out that that is almost literally the only transit funding historically available from the state. There's a big, giant box for transit that's much bigger than local roads or highways. There are other sources from the state, gas taxes. There are existing gas taxes. The governor would have you increase the gas tax, and you've talked a lot about where that would go. But below that, there's existing streams for streets and roads and highways, which is not an argument for taking anybody's money. Public buses use streets and roads. We use highways. All of us in the room use the streets and roads and highways. There should be a healthy mix. But this chart possibly overemphasizes in your mind all the money that is supposed to go to transit. And I'm not saying it all should go to transit, and I'll conclude on that point, Mr. Chair, but I want to point out there's a much more robust basket of revenues for a variety of modes, except for transit, where we have relied 100%, almost 100% on this money. So what is the real reason? It is true that 3 years ago, Mr. Chair, our association entered into a lawsuit in the courts saying we think the diversions from the public transportation account that year were illegal. We didn't do that because transit agencies are greedy. We did that because the people voted in 1990 when they passed Proposition 116 to make the revenues that go into this account a trust fund. They designated it as a trust fund status, and they said the revenue that is put in there has to be spent on local public transit or the state's intercity rail program and other good state transit programs like that. The people definitely said you can't spend this money on a variety of general fund programs. As great as those general fund programs are, you didn't really have that choice. So it seems to us the governor has said if we don't have a choice, if we can't keep using this trust fund to float our general fund deficit in the absence of other solutions, then let's just take the money away from transit entirely. I want you folks to know that my bosses called the Department of Finance and the bosses over there in July of last year before the California State Supreme Court acted and said, right before we get the final word from the court, we might lose, you might lose, let us sit down and talk about all the money that is at stake. Let us try to find a solution that is reasonable because we know you are in a tough position. We know you've got $20 billion worth of pain that you're facing. Notwithstanding the pain that local bus riders and everybody else who relies on transit systems are facing, isn't there something we can do to stop this madness and figure out a compromise? And that's what we have offered to your leadership. We've offered to the leadership in the other house. And our basic solution would be to say, don't undo 40 years of public policy, at least with regard to the reliance of public transit on the sales taxes generated by the state from fuel and diesel. Let's step back, look at all the money that has been generated, and figure out if there isn't a way under the construct of the case law that is now on the books, and figure out a plan, a short-term plan, even a multi-year plan, where we take some of that money and put it into the general fund and restore some of it, just some of it, for public transit. That's what my bosses are willing to look at right now because they're at zero, and frankly, they've been pushed to the cliff. The governor's proposal does that. Great, we get it. We're sorry. We're sorry we sued. We're sorry we proved in court that the people want this money spent on transit. Let's work with you to find a compromise. Let's not blow up the entire program. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Deanne Baker, representing the California State Association of Counties. In addition to the transit cuts that Josh eloquently provided with you, we want to mention that you accurately identified two of our other primary concerns. One is, of course, swapping a growing revenue stream with one that's declining, and we've seen historically that Proposition 42 and the sales tax has grown by an annual percentage of about 4%. While the gas tax, of course, is about 1%, and we know that's declining with more fuel-efficient vehicles and increased attention to reducing vehicle miles traveled. So in the long term, yes, we're reducing funding for all aspects of the transportation system. Secondly, of course, is the loss of the borrowing restrictions under the Constitution, which you've also acknowledged. And let me just mention that this comes at a time when the local system is chronically underfunded. As you heard from the LAO about the state system, that is true of the local system. The League and CSAC just came out with an extremely comprehensive needs assessment that looked at data covering 93% of the city, street, and county road system. By the way, we own and operate 81% of the state's maintained miles. And the findings of that report showed that we have a $71 billion shortfall over the next decade just to maintain the city, street, and county road system in a good condition. That's $7 billion a year that we're short in funding just to preserve that system. So at this time, we don't think we can afford this type of proposal. Thank you.
Sorry. Juliana Vorse with the Urban Counties Caucus, representing the 12 most populous counties in the state. I certainly concur with the statements from Deanne Baker from CSAC. Our three main issues are the removal of the constitutional protections under Proposition 42, the severe impact on transit at a time when we have a lot of unemployed that need that transit system, and it just is another burden on counties when we have increased demand for services across all spectrums of our services that we provide, and also additionally the needs that are out there on our local streets and roads. So we respectfully oppose this proposal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Jennifer Whiting with the League of California Cities. Most of our concerns have been addressed, so I'm just going to briefly let you know what our top concerns are. Number one for our members is the severe impact on transit, on the number of jobs, on the availability of transit to residents of cities. Also, we feel that there's and this has been discussed, a policy disconnect for the state because of the AB 32 and SB 375 requirements that cities are trying to implement in the next few years, and now suddenly transit, the funding for transit is going to be eliminated at the state level. We're also very concerned with the constitutional protections being removed. And we're also looking longer term past the 10 years that is included in the trailer language. And we're concerned that overall local government funding for transportation could be eroded after that 10-year period. Thank you.
Good evening, Gus Corey with the City and County Association of Governments for San Mateo County and Santa Cruz Metro. I think Josh pretty much encapsulated most of the arguments, and so a couple points just to add on. It's not just about job creation, it's about job retention. In Santa Cruz, MTD, they're going to lay off about 150 people. Samtrans, they've already laid off 50 people, and that's only months after the last budget was enacted. In San Mateo County, we're built out. We have 2 sales taxes already, and so our local electeds don't feel confident about going to the voters again for a replacement source of funding. 1,600 jobs lost statewide. And finally, one thing that hasn't been mentioned is high-speed rail. If we're really serious about making high-speed rail a reality, you can't defund the current systems that are providing connectivity to that system. So we would ask you to consider that. We think there's a solution. We're working closely with the California Transit Association. We'd love to sit down with you and talk about an alternative to what the governor has proposed and what we're also hearing the legislature is considering. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members, Michael Turner on behalf of the LA County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. I just want to add my voice to those who have spoken before me, in particular what Josh has said about the impacts to local transit and of course the connections to SB 375. But for us, it's a matter of jobs preservation. I mean, we've been able to stave off a lot of these cuts because our local voters have supported transit in Los Angeles County, but we're looking at significant service cuts in the coming year, and we're also looking at exercising what is our local fee option, because we already have a local fee option, and it's a fare increase. And that is, as Assemblymember Fuhr mentioned, a shift in the burden for carrying the responsibility for the system. So we've made a lot of progress in Los Angeles County. We have the opportunity to make a lot more progress. But a lot of that comes to a grinding halt if you take the state's funding out of the equation. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members, Leslie McFadden representing the Sacramento County Board of Supervisors. Want to echo the comments of my county colleagues on this proposal in opposition. Prop 42 is worth $10 million in Sacramento County in the unincorporated area, and we are very concerned about giving up that revenue source in exchange for an excise tax that is not going to grow as fast as the chair pointed out. And we also are very concerned about the elimination of the transit funds. We consider transit to be an integral part of the transportation system in our county and don't want to see those funds cut either. Thank you very much for allowing us to have so much time on this issue today also. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Keith Dunn, Executive Director of the Self-Help Counties Coalition, representing 19 counties throughout the state. I will echo the passionate statements of Mr. Shaw, who knows this issue better than any of us. Clearly, this is one of those proposals that's penny wise and pound foolish. We like to talk about this being a transit problem, but when reality hits it, this is a transportation problem, because when we remove the funding for public transit, we put additional burdens on our roads and highways. So it drags us all down. It impacts our ability for those of us that have jobs to get to those jobs. It also puts the jobs at risk that work in the Transit Association and their members. So on behalf of the Self-Help Counties, we oppose this governor's tax swap and look forward to working with this body as we look to find solutions to ensure that the transportation programs here in the state continue to operate. We can do it, and we're ready to work with you.
Thank you. Anyone else from local government? Okay, we're going to move on. We're grouping folks and for labor leaders. And
Mr. Chairman, members, Barry Broad on behalf of the Teamsters Amalgamated Transit Union and the machinists. First of all, let's slow down here and look at the situation. We got a lame duck governor, and let's get to some basic politics. Nobody listens very much to lame duck governors because they're here for a few months and they just want to get out of town. And this is a get out of town proposal because there's not one aspect of it that is real after year one. Not one. Not the escalator, not this, not that. All the money that is that goes under Article 19, that's an excise tax, can be borrowed. And I have heard both the Speaker and the Pro Tem and everybody else around here say to me, if it ain't nailed down and you can borrow it, we're gonna borrow it. Now, so it's a sucker bet. It's an obvious sucker bet. I mean, I don't even know why we're even pretending here. Mr. Shaw has pointed out the 100 reasons why it's a sucker bet. Obviously, the system we have was thought out at a time to be calibrated to produce greater revenue when gasoline prices go up and people become more transit dependent and move out of their cars. We are at the place demographically in California where that's happening now anyway. We're starting to look like the eastern states where people of all sorts are permanently transit dependent. They're doing what we've sort of asked them to do, which is get out of their cars to reduce emissions, to reduce crowding on the freeways, and then we pass this AB 32 thing, and then we undercut it for some short-term, 1 year, and if history is any evidence, 6-month solution, which will, not be worth the paper it's written on 6 months from now. And I think it's time to take a deep breath, slow down, just cancel this whole idea before it turns into, it's got that bums rush thing, that happens around here. Oh, we got to do it by this Friday. Oh, yeah? I don't think so. There's nothing that says you guys have to do anything. Think of all the this Fridays we had in the last couple of years in which things got done that all of you probably really regret. So I would urge you to back up. I don't care if it's flying over here from the Senate with all the bells and whistles. Just say, we're not doing it now. We're not going to change fundamental policy in order to get a 6-month deal. Doesn't make any sense. It's not good policy. It's crappy politics, frankly, and it's going to be counterproductive. So I would urge you to just dump this thing. Thank you.
Yeah, we ask people to actually tell us what they think and not hide their feelings in the.
I've lost my temper anyway. What the heck?
Mr. Chairman, members, Mike Anderson with the United Transportation Union. Besides what Barry says, our organization represents both bus drivers and rail. So that, as somebody Monning alluded to, that the devastation that it'll cause to the many thousands of our members who, besides having to go either on unemployment or find other trades, they will also not be able to take their customers, those people that are transit dependent, and get them to the doctor, get them to school, get them to work, get them around since they don't have cars. So I think we should think about that. Those are all additional costs. Plus, you might have, if and when we ever get some funding and a stable force, that then we're going to have to reestablish these routes. Then we're going to have to hire these people back. Where are they going to be? Are they going to wait around to be called back as their unemployment goes off? Probably not. So therefore, we have to train new people, and that training will be very expensive. And this has not been calculated in by the governor's proposal, so we should look at that part. Also, on the rail sector, California is the envy of the nation in moving people by rail. High-speed rail, which we totally endorse the concept of high-speed rail, it's not here yet, and it will not be here for the foreseeable future. So let's not tear down the best system that we've had in years just because we want to take some money away. Anyway, thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, members, Pat Moran with Aaron Reed and Associates, representing the professional engineers in California government. We certainly concur with what Mr. Broad has to say. We should slow this process down and think about what we're doing with all the transportation infrastructure needs we have in California. It's certainly not the time to be reducing funding for them. So with that, we're opposed to the governor's proposal. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else from the labor community? Otherwise, I'd like to call up folks, environmental advocates.
Got up on the wrong panel.
I know there's a lot of crossover there.
Go ahead.
Catherine Phillips with Environmental Defense Fund. Transportation causes about 28% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state. If you look at the criteria pollutants, the stuff that kills and otherwise debilitates children and adults all over the state, mobile sources are responsible for about 66% of that pollution. One of the things that has been, the words that's been used a lot by each side and everybody in this conversation today has been system. The transportation system is a system. If you're going to fix it, if you're going to make sure that the economy still moves, at the same time as you reduce its environmental impact, you have to think of it as a system. And as part of that system, you can't take out pieces. You can't act like it's an expendable rivet from an airplane. You have to make sure all the rivets are in there and in tight. Californians need choice. If they want to be able to make that shift from higher polluting vehicles to a way of transportation that's less polluting, they need to have a lot of choice. Most people aren't going to ride a bus every day, but there are a lot of people who are willing to ride a bus one day a week. If we take those buses away, they don't have that option. We're not going to get those pollution reductions. We're not going to get to the goals that the governor and the legislature have both said that they endorse, and that's the goals of reducing greenhouse gases in this state and reducing criteria pollutants. That's why I think among other things, among other reasons, this proposal is a huge disappointment to us. It won't help us get to the goals that we've all agreed we need to get to. I think it's also worth noting, we had somebody go out and do some research for us to provide a paper to the legislature, to some of the staff, about looking at what other states are doing, what some of the options might be for transportation. And we found that about 37 states provide some kind of transit funding that has the opportunity to be used for operations funding. That's 37 states when California was still part of it. That would make California in the minority if they adopt the governor's proposal. And one of the things that I find personally most disappointing is for more than a year we've been banging the drum over here and asking that the legislature, anticipating and seeing that we're at a crisis, asking that they pull together a task force, pull together some kind of a special subcommittee, whatever it is that's needed, to bring in some experts to sit down to figure out how are we going to solve this problem. And the way you solve this problem is you identify what it is, and then you lay out a case for it, and then you bring people along. What's happened is that there's just been the tendency to eliminate a lot of potential solutions because they don't think the public's going to go along with it. They don't think they could get something through a new tax because the public's not going to go along with it. Well, as the economy was diving in Los Angeles, the public voted itself a new tax specifically for transportation, of which 60% was going to go to transit. So I urge you to reject this proposal. And I'm also concerned about a similar proposal that we're hearing may arise from the other house. That's not the way to solve this. It's cutting out operations funding is not the way to solve the funding crisis for transit, and it's certainly not the way to get us to our environmental goals. Thank you.
Michael Endicott with Sierra Club California, and I'm going to give you the mass transit version of lobbying. I'm also representing Tina Andolina of PCL. She's joining me in my comments, so we'll combine them and shorten them that way. I think the way the chair's comments and the comments of the members of the panel set the key questions up exactly right, so I won't dwell on them, but the whole difference, the discussion you had today is wonderful on the difference between an excise tax and a sales tax and the consequences, not only financially and the opportunities lost, but also the environmental consequences of that and the bias in it as to who we're selecting in doing this choice. So when we look at the overall natural resources arena, whether it's forestry, fish and game, we know that in the current budget situation, some programs won't get carried on to the fullest extent or at different kinds of haircuts. But we don't undo the standards that we have in place. We know that we're going to get out of this, we're going to come back, and we want to keep those standards and then build the programs back up to them. So keeping this structure of the sales tax that goes to the operation for the transit funding is critical. And that's why we're concerned not only this proposal, but the other one that's sort of rumored of the gas tax swap. It just doesn't make sense, and you've gone into that in depth. And those are the way, keep those two questions in the forefront of the debate, please. I have done some other data. You got some good data from Joshua Shaw, but there is a difference of riders of need and riders of choice. My son, who I live in San Francisco, when I'm up here testifying now, has to go to his high school. When I'm there and I do choose to drive him, it's only 15 minutes ride, but otherwise he has to take 2 buses, and if they connect perfectly, it takes him 45 minutes at a minimum, twice a day. That's him trying to do homework on a bus or whatever. As routes change or are cut, other people, jobs or schools, that could take a lot longer time. And that makes it impossible to be there on time. Then you get penalized for not being there on time, particularly if you're an hourly wage worker. So that's a really big concern in this. Also, I guess you'd call me and riders of choice. As the bus routes cut back, they get more crowded, then the people who have automobiles are going to choose to use those. And it compounds the problems. The highways that get more crowded. I'm a rider of obligation because I lobby on this issue, so I try to use mass transit whenever I possibly can, and I can tell you that the mass transit agencies, their numbers are real. All of them, San Francisco, the ones I use, San Francisco Muni, Caltrain, BART, AC Transit, Amtrak, and even here in Sacramento, all of their rates have gone up several times in the past couple of years, and they're already announcing new ones. And here in Sacramento, unless you happen to live on the route that's going to take you to the place, you can't get a transfer. You know, in San Francisco, you still have 2 hours. You can go on as many buses to get anywhere in the city. But here, they've taken away that transfer, upping the rate. So I guess this is definitely the wrong and a cynical way, I think, to deal with a lawsuit that clearly said what the law should be and what it was intended to do. And I think your LAO's report was too geared to the structure of the question that was put before you. I don't think you had enough analysis of these consequences for transit. And these other options that they said dealt nothing with that issue and really is a problem. On top of that, and the last thing really is we have to be aware of what we're trying to do at the federal level as well, T4 funds. Many of us environmental groups are working in how they structure what those funds should be and how they're restricted when they're handed down to the states. And we've been working to make sure it's flexible so that we can use it as we build California's future system to reduce vehicle miles traveled under AB 32, SB 375, and other local programs, that transit should be involved in that. But what message does that send to the federal government if we get rid of all the transit funding and the structural basis for having that funding? So I think certainly this program is pound foolish, and I don't even think it's penny wise. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tina Andolina, thanks you very much.
All right. Next, we've business community leaders. Is there anyone? I know there were folks here. Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dave Ackerman, representing the Associated General Contractors. I represent the people who work, build both transit projects and highway projects. We're concerned with the proposal, its impact on jobs. You can't take $1 billion out of a program and pretend that it doesn't have some impact somewhere. What hasn't been mentioned by any of the transit agencies and the like is a good portion of the money, I think almost half, is for transit capital. And that's construction projects. Most of those are union labor, union projects. So contractors I represent are signatory contractors on those jobs. And those are high-paying jobs. You take an operating engineer or a carpenter or labor, which we represent, those are high-paying, good-paying jobs that pay taxes. If you take $700 million out of the construction side, that's probably about 12 to 14,000 jobs that disappear. And if you're into job creation, I don't define that as job creation to do that. The other things I'm a little concerned about is there's been a lot of discussion on sales tax versus gas tax. If you go down that route, the governor's in his proposal, I've seen the language, puts I call it not a growth factor, an index. I'm calling it kind of maintenance factor for Prop 42. I think there's a way to do that with the gas tax if you go down that route. But I think Mr. Broad's comments were right to be very, very careful. Don't act too quickly because you'll look back. And I have an adage, I have a sign on my desk that says there's no right way to do the wrong thing. And I think you've got to be extremely careful and cautious in how you do this. If you do a proposal such as what the governor's proposed or what we hear about in the Senate, you're going to change the essence of transportation funding forever in California for a short-term gain. And we're really wondering how beneficial that short-term gain is and what the consequences are for that. So I just urge caution and care in doing this.
Mr. Chair and members, Mark Smith on behalf of the American Council of Engineering Companies of California. I will identify with those concerns that were previously mentioned. I just want to highlight two areas, the first of which is that we believe it's just flat out incorrect that a majority vote fee would be protected under the Article 19 constitutional provisions as has been proposed by the governor and proposed by leaders in the Senate. We strongly believe that that which can be imposed by majority vote can be eliminated or redirected through a majority vote, and that those Article 19 provisions do not apply. As an organization, we are more than willing to assist in any discussion of raising infrastructure funding. I mean, we were hours away from an actual increase in the excise tax last year during budget negotiations. We still felt that that increase of 12 cents fell far short than where it needed to be in order to support necessary infrastructure development, but it is a discussion that needs to be had under the appropriate circumstances and with the appropriate two-thirds protections to qualify for constitutional protection. And I also want to touch on the fact that we have a strong policy and fiscal disconnect here. This legislature and the governor keep passing policies that emphasize transit-oriented development, reductions in greenhouse gases, vehicle miles traveled. Yet on the other hand, we keep eliminating all funding sources for those programs. AB 32, SB 375, the most recent discussion, I think just indicate a strong disconnect between the type of legislative proposals we keep agreeing to and the fiscal reality of the state of California. Thank you.
Is there any additional comments from any member of the public or group or anyone at this point? Speak now, forever hold your peace. Any additional comments from members or questions? With that, I want to thank you all for coming out. I think we did a good job of vetting this issue, and it is clearly an important one and one we're going to have to deal with in the near future. Thank you.